I'm Gerald Ball. I grew up on Banjo Branch, and my family is, I think I'm the fifth generation up here at the very head of Banjo Branch. And I lived up here until I was 7 years old, 8 years old, and then we moved part of the way down the holler when we built our own house, moved from where my grandparents were living, and we were living with them. My my daddy and his uncles all were tobacco farmers. There was really not any other cash crop in this particular area, and the barns, the one behind me, is a barn that I was real familiar with because my uncle uh, and daddy and any of the relatives would come here at tobacco cutting time and hang tobacco in this barn. And down below, behind me, are stalls that they had their mules in at night, had two mules and two cows that they milked. Uh, in the upper part of this barn, there's a casing house where they worked tobacco in the fall when tobacco cured. Well, a barn was a playhouse especially during the summer when school was out. We would climb up in the tier poles where the tobacco was hung, and I don't know how we kept from falling out and breaking our neck or our arms or whatever. But anyway, it was a playground in the summertime when it was hot. We'd climb into the barn, my cousins and I. Uh, and it also, in one of the areas of the barn, there was a place where they kept corn, and it was wired in to keep rats out. But they, if it wasn't corn season, then the door just stayed open, and they had chickens that would roost in the barn, and they would go in that particular room, and there was a nest, a wooden nest up on the side of the wall, maybe a couple of them, and they laid eggs. And I remember one time, uh, in particular, going over there to gather eggs. And when I reached in there, I felt something slick, and I looked, and it was a big black snake coiled up in the bottom of that nest, and he had been eating eggs, and there were still some around there. And I'm sure I screamed till you could hear me at Mars Hill, and I went flying out of there to go to the house to tell Mama what my experience was in that. So I don't know if I ever gathered eggs again out of that nest. Well, in the fall of the year, just about the time school started, or a little bit before, would be tobacco cutting time. Our family, all of the Ball families, grew burley tobacco, and about the 1st of August is when it would be getting ripe and mature, ready to be cut. And I remember this one family that lived down the road here, just not even a quarter of a mile from this barn where I am. Uh, they were looking up, just looking out the window, I guess, or out in the yard, and they saw tobacco literally flying through the air. And what the story was about that is the tobacco uh, was up on a pretty steep hill, and it was really too steep to get a tractor across very safely. So somebody came up with the idea of tying a wire to a tree stump above that tobacco patch. And so they would cut the tobacco and put it on sticks. Anyway, they ran that wire over to the barn and tied it on a tier pole. And then they put 5 stalks of tobacco on a stick, and they would spread it out and then push it together on that wire. And it was on a pretty big slant, so it would go sailing down that wire and go right to the barn. It never fell off because they had just squeezed it together. And our neighbors down the way were out there looking, and they just could hardly believe what they were seeing. They were watching tobacco flying through the air, out of the field into the barn, and they just were in total disbelief. So that was a real good story for a lot of years.